Our panelists this evening include 4 distinguished speakers. Andrew Altman, a distinguished university professor of philosophy at Georgia State University. Barry Hirch, who holds the W.J. Usery Chair of the American Workplace at Georgia State, and he teaches in the economics department at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. Paula Stephan, who you've heard of before, who's professor of economics here at Georgia State, and Madeline, who is professor of economics at Agnes College in Decatur, and who works extensively on themes in immigration and economic mobility. You can read a bit more about each of our panelists in the brochure. So I'll turn it over to them for some impromptu remarks, and then we can open it up to a general Q&A.
In listening to the 2 talks, I was trying to figure a way to say something that kind of brings the 2 together, where there's some intersection, and finding that a little bit difficult. But let me try. I may fail. First, turning to Richard's talk, and this really goes to some of his earlier work. I think it's worth talking more broadly about globalization. And there we think of globalization as flows across borders. When you think of those flows in globalization, you typically think of trade in goods and services, capital flows, investments across borders, and of course people or immigration, people moving between countries. And then in Richard's recent work, he, as he did tonight, has emphasized the importance of knowledge, which is really embedded in people, in goods, both capital goods and consumer goods. And there, the more freely these flows occur, it tends to not completely equalize, but compress or bring closer together so-called prices. So in the case of goods and services, price differences are mitigated by flows of goods and services across countries, returns on capital investments, differences in goods, that is, investments go where they can provide return. And then, of course, for people and people flows, immigration is far more restricted than capital flows or goods flows, partly because, of course, the laws are restricted, but even absent those laws, immigration would be much less than those other flows because of language barriers, cultural barriers, and then people like to stay or tend to stay near where they grew up. But to the extent that we do have people flows across countries, you do see some compression in wages. Again, Richard has demonstrated some of that, though it's tough to compare wage data across countries. Everybody knows inequality has been rising. It's true that in most countries, within countries, inequality has risen. But if you look at world inequality as if it were a single entity, inequality has decreased. The reason being that some of the poorest countries, particularly China and India, where everybody lives, has had relatively rapid rises in income, and that has tended to reduce overall world inequality. So again, it strikes me there that immediately who makes decisions, who has rights, but these decisions with respect to these flows, these moral questions or ethical questions arise not just for people flows, but for possibly other flows as well. And often the problem is that a single country, what may be in their interest isn't it. That is, if multiple countries can come into agreement or cooperate, such as through international trade, that can increase the overall size of the pie. But individuals making decisions or nation states making decisions, wholly constant or given everybody else's decisions, they may not want to cooperate. And so I think that turns, and this goes to states' the rights of states, nation states, which Chris talked about. And there, I guess rather than focus, and again, economists probably aren't good at saying much about rights and whatnot, but what we do think about more is who makes decisions, and I think the emphasis here maybe ought to be more not just on individual rights or what rights states have, but rather this distinction between narrow or individual decisions versus broader group decisions, and how we get more cooperation and coordination across persons, across nation states, etc. And again, something like global warming, I think, is a classic example where it is presumably in the interest of the world community to reduce carbon emissions for the very long run. But it may not be in the interest of individual countries to do so, and certainly not individuals per se. Hence, we lose our rights in some sense. We have to be constrained for the global good or for the broad good to do what we would not naturally do. So in thinking about rights, at least as an economist thinking about rights, rather than thinking about these rights as being somehow innate, I guess I would try to think of it more in terms of how do individuals and groups and nation states try to cooperate for some greater good.
So I'm so glad Barry and First intended to find common ground between these presentations because I can't do it. But they were both very interesting, and to me they raised a number of interesting questions that I don't think we really know the answers to. And one of them, I think Kit's presentation brought up in particular, is do countries have a duty to exclude certain people? And he said that, well, you have this right to exclude. But should you actually, from a global perspective, perhaps exclude certain people? I think that this may be the common ground between Kit and Research's presentation, is that when lots of skilled immigrants come to the United States or to other developed countries, what happens to the country they leave behind? And I think that people are very divided on brain drain and whether it's a myth or reality. It's something we don't really have a good answer to. But if we did know the answer, would that then interfere with the right of states to admit the groups that it wants, or the immigrants that it wants? Or would states then have a duty to exclude skilled immigrants and then to perhaps take refugees and so on? So that's one question that sort of the intersectionality of these two presentations. Another thing that presentations bring to mind for me is that we don't really know a lot about the relative costs and benefits of having an immigrant come to the U.S. versus stay home. Again, this brain drain question, as to when they receive their education. And so Richard's presentation, I think, says that it's good when immigrants come here, they get an education here, and then they stay here because they're very productive. They contribute a lot to patents, to scientific publications, to the workforce, and all this. Well, if they stay at home, they might contribute, make an equal and perhaps even bigger contribution at home. But suppose they came after getting their education in their home country. So the U.S. didn't pay to educate them. They came later. Would that be even better for us from an economic standpoint if we think solely from the U.S. instead of from a global or multilateral perspective? I think that's a very intriguing question to which we have absolutely no idea what the answer is. And my third point, so I feel like I have to plug my own research here. Of course, that's what economists are good at, although Barry uses the presentation very nicely, is that whether having more immigrants working in the United States leads to crowd out. And so immigrants in the United States who are highly skilled, particularly those who have masters and PhDs, tend to be very much in STEM fields, right? In science, engineering, technology, and mathematics. And do they crowd out U.S. natives from those fields? We don't necessarily have a great grasp of the answer to that, but what my research with Pierre Arrhenius shows is that it looks like having more immigrants come to the U.S. As young adults leads to crowd out of U.S.-born women from science majors. And that's certainly something that might concern us given the underrepresentation of women in science. And so those are three things which I think we would like to know more about.
So they were very interesting presentations, and I'm going to even steer more towards trying to connect all the pieces there. But, and I should say that most of my work looks at the role of foreign-born in knowledge production, both in the United States and in 15 other countries. And so, one thing we know for sure is that production of knowledge has clearly benefits by open board, okay? And one of the major reasons, it's not just that brighter people immigrate, it's also that people who are mobile look for good places to match their skills and their talents and their knowledge. So part of this mobility in itself can enhance people's production of knowledge because they've gotten in the right place to where they can be extremely productive. And so we see that not only in people who come to the U.S. to work, who are foreign-born in science, but we see it if they go to Australia, we see it when they go to Great Britain, we see it when they go to Switzerland, we see it when they go to Japan. I mean, this is not just a U.S. effect here. And I think it's really important to remember that in many ways we all benefit. And when I say we all benefit, we benefit regardless of what country we're in from this. Because one of the special things about knowledge is that you can't exclude people from it once it's been produced in ways. And so if mobility enhances the production of knowledge, it enhances what is available for all of us, regardless of what country we're in. And then, of course, lots of knowledge gets embedded into new technology, and that new technology generally spreads and diffuses quite quickly across countries. I think it's also, and particularly in light of something Madeline said, important to realize that in all of our research, and we have a survey of 19,000 scientists working in 16 countries, one of the things we find is that people really keep networks. People who move are very networked with where they came from and with people from their country who've moved to a third country. And we definitely know this when we study Indian inventors in the U.S., but we see it when we study people in material science who move. You keep these networks, and in a sense, one of the reasons that these clusters tend to be so productive is you stay networked with people at home, and in that sense, the home country definitely benefits. And then in just closing, I'd like to just pick up on what Madeline said. I think we are. I think it's important to realize that immigration, particularly at the high skill, has some costs associated with it. As somebody who's thought a lot about these displacement costs. And I think in the United States, we see these most in the job description postdoc, okay? So some of you probably know that most university labs are heavily staffed by postdocs. We have over 60,000 postdocs working in this country, and well over 60% of them are here on a temporary visa. And to pick up on Madeline's point, over 50% of them got their PhD abroad and came here, okay? There are a variety of reasons why they come, but there's almost an infinite supply of them. And one thing that's pretty clear is that postdocs are probably the least well paid of anybody in this world, given how much education they have. So the starting salary for a postdoc is $39,000, and we're talking about somebody who, in most scientific disciplines, has spent 7 years in a PhD program. And any way you cut the data, it's very clear that our very open doors have encouraged people to come to take that position. And in many ways, it's because of our visa system that once you're here, you have a much higher probability of staying. So people come and take these positions, and I would completely concur with what Madeline says. To the extent that these wages have been very low, they push out people who are natives who might think about that career.
I have one relatively simple point that I'd like to make and elaborate on a bit, and although I won't be saying anything about the content of Kit's paper, his remarks, which I totally agree with, I will say something about Kit that connects him to what Richard Freeman and some others have been talking about. So here's my simple point. The globalization in education and knowledge that has occurred in science and technology is not limited to those fields, but actually extends to the humanities as well. And this may seem a bit surprising at first glance, because as Richard Freeman has said, the laws of mathematics are the same in China as they are anywhere else in the world. 2 plus 2 equals 4, any place you go. On the other hand, the kinds of issues and questions that humanities address do not seem so cut and dry, and in fact do appear to be strongly influenced in the way people address them by the variation in cultural background across the world. So 2 plus 2 equals 4 in China, but what counts as a valid human right, it's not so clear that when it's discussed in China, that the agreement that is reached there would conform to what the agreement would be if people in the United States or with Europe discussed that question. So humanities being viewed as relatively soft in relation to the quote hard sciences, where there are cut and dry right answers, might seem to be an unpromising area for globalization, because globalization precisely has to cut across the cultural differences, which would seem to establish boundaries around what fruitful discussion in the humanities could accomplish across borders. And yet, there has been enormous globalization in the humanities, and in philosophy in particular, over the last 30 years. I began as a young philosopher, freshly minted PhD in 1977. Nobody I knew in philosophy, none of my colleagues, older colleagues or young colleagues, was engaged in any kind of work with people from outside the United States. Everything was done entirely inside the United States. The only exceptions were that we would read journals that were published in England and outside, but there was no collaboration between people working on philosophical research projects in the United States and people working abroad. There was really no collaboration to speak of. There was an occasional international conference, but that was about the extent of it. Also at the time, it was predicted that although the job market in philosophy was dismal, it would get even more dismal when the 1980s came around, because demographers looked at the number of 5 to 12-year-olds that were in the United States and said, well, that number is decreasing. So college enrollments are going to plummet in the 1980s. Sorry, philosophers are almost going to be all out of jobs because there are not going to be enough students to teach. Well, there was one missing part of the equation which the demographers had gotten to plug in, and that was international students. The influx of international students over the 80s and 90s more than made up for the demographic dip in the number of college-age Americans and helped to at least stabilize the philosophy job market as dismal and not any worse than that. So I'm here in large part because the demographers were wrong and globalization was something of a success in philosophy. But Kidd was also a living example of the globalization of philosophy. Just last semester, he was in Oxford for one of their terms, working on a project and discussing it with the philosophers in England. A couple of years before, he was at Australian National University working on a very large team project addressing philosophical issues. Now, in the United States, we tend not to give a lot of money to philosophers. The government shells out money to scientists, almost as if it's going out of style, but philosophers they're a bit more stingy. In Europe and other places, not so. So in Germany, there are philosophers who have gotten huge grants, millions of dollars / euros, and have constructed teams of philosophers and social scientists and humanities people to work on various projects. And indeed, the philosophy department here at Georgia State has been the fortunate beneficiary of one of these German grants, and over the past couple of years, we've been involved in international projects in collaboration with a philosopher at Bielefeld University, whose funded by some prize from the German government. And there are other philosophers across Europe and Australia who have large-scale projects going that involve teamwork in philosophy, which one would otherwise have been perhaps somewhat skeptical about, but certainly did not exist in anywhere near the form it exists now when I began my career. So things have changed globally in philosophy and humanities, as well as the sciences and technology.
So I'm far too long-winded to respond to all these interesting points, but I would like to accept Madeline's invitation to use a bit about brain drain, because I think this is a rather important question, whether developed countries have a duty to exclusions. So what's happening is, what's happening, am I there now? To give you a characterization, or maybe a caricature, is you've got countries like Canada, for instance, that are looking around and saying, what do we want? Well, we need more nurses, we need more doctors, we need more engineers, and that drives their immigration, and they actually go out and actively recruit these talented people from developing countries. So you have the affluent basically skimming the cream from these developing countries in such a way that it feels like it's got to be objectionable. So for instance, we don't have that much of a problem with the quantity of medical professionals in the world. We have a problem with the distribution, right? And so in Africa, for instance, there's just not enough doctors and nurses to go around with the minimum basic medical health care. If you think, as I do, that there's a human right to health care, and you see that Canadians are without compensation actively recruiting these healthcare professionals from developing countries, then perhaps Canadians are complicit in a human rights violation. Absolutely.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you make exactly the same point Kit makes about what's happening to doctors in the state of Georgia, okay? So urban centers in the state of Georgia are attracting and bringing doctors here, and the number of rural hospitals that has closed in the state of Georgia in recent years is just astonishing. So there are huge parts of Georgia geographically that have no good access to care. And so I think it's important to, I agree with you, I think your point is very well made, but I think it's also interesting to think that we can have a lot of domestic examples of that as well.
Just one footnote on that, and I think I would push back a little bit on those comments that the supply of, say, nurses is not fixed to the extent that there exists a market in the U.S. for developed countries. Countries such as the Philippines then develop education markets and nursing markets that would not otherwise exist. And I know there is some research on that. So brain drain seems like a no-brainer at first ethically, but then when you study particular markets to some extent, it's not at all so obvious that you're encouraging people to get more education, to develop training, and then that potentially can help nursing, say, both in the Philippines as well as in the U.S. And again, Madeline, I think that's what much more about that.
But it only helps if they stay. Suppose that the Philippines or that some country in Africa spends a lot of money training medical professionals and then they leave. Then they're much worse off than having another spend the time.
Yes, so I shouldn't say no-brainer and brain drain in the same sense, but I did not mean to suggest that the question of brain drain was a no-brainer. I think it's actually quite complicated. So my initial inclination is to deal with this just as I deal with immigration disjunctive, which is to say if the global affluent are not going to admit the global poor, then they have an obligation to help the global poor where they are. My initial inclination is to say if countries like Canada are going to bring in value and skilled laborers from developing countries, then they incur a duty to compensate people where they are and to treat that disjunctively. Now, people like David Miller argue, no, if you're really worried about the worst off people in the world, then you can't do that because with these people all these people leaving, what ends up happening is when you open your borders, the worse off people are even worse off. Counterpoint by people like Christian Miller is that this doesn't take into consideration remittances. Right? Remittances dwarf foreign aid. If you look at how much money is going back from immigrants to their home countries, this is having a dramatic effect. Counterpoint to that is somebody like Gillian Brock, who is, as we speak, co-authoring a book on the ethics of brain drain and Michael Brock, emphasizes that you run around with Nobel economists much more than I. I do have a colleague, Doug North, who is a Nobel economist and made his name suggesting that the biggest way to improve life in developing countries is through institutions, the building of institutions. And what Gillian Brock highlights is that even though remittances help, when you lose these skilled individuals, they're precisely the people who are most likely to construct the institutions that developing countries need to help the world's worse off. So I think it's complicated. I think you're absolutely right. This is something that needs much more attention. The question of brain drain and whether there's a duty to exclude.
I just want to remind everybody that there are individuals who decide to go from one country to another, and they have some rights as individuals to do things. You try to keep me out of your country, but I will try very hard to get in if it's going to be better for me and my family. We have many undocumented people. Refugees will appear in different places. They will die going on boats to Australia. And we shouldn't think about this as the state, the state, the legitimate state, was a careful thing that said. But there's also got to be some rights to individuals. And, economics sort of predicates most things on individuals. I can choose what to buy, I can choose where to go, and so on and so forth. The states can't set up barriers. But individuals will often get around those barriers because people make their own minds up.